Hi, Andy. How are you?
Mm.
Hello, Graham. Lovely to see you. Hello, Walter. Can see you too.
Good to see. How are you?
Good, good. Welcome, everyone, to this penultimate Senterej series dialogue. I think a lot of you know, and for those who are unhappy about us not being on US time today, sorry about that, but we're trying to get more east of New York. So the series really started looking at everything that was changing based on Jerry's idea of the metaphor of Senterej, which is Ethiopian chess, which starts with this flurry of activity and no rules. And these dialogues started looking at aid, trade, and the financial architecture. And this is therefore the fifth in the series. We've looked at aid, trade, philanthropy, financial innovation, and we're now looking at, I'm going to say the word so that Mahmoud, I speak to your point, the architecture of debt, and Mahmoud can respond to that. Yeah, so thank you all for being here. This is being recorded. Please use the chat. Last time we had a very active chat and it was very useful for everybody in the discussion to track questions. So feel free to make your comments. Peter will do the introductions. We'll have the first half as we usually do, which is a dialogue, and then open to all of you. So Peter, I'm going to hand over to you.
Great. Thank you, Tamsin. Just want to check everyone can hear me clearly. If anyone can give a thumbs up or thumbs down. Okay, that looks good. We'll just give it another kind of 30 seconds or so for people to join, particularly people who are having to get up early in the US or those time zones. And then we'll move in. I should start, though, with apologies from Jason from the African Forum on Debt and Development, who was going to be joining us today, but has been called away for pre-G20 activities. We've still got three great panelists. So Mahmoud will kick us off. Mahmoud is the UN Special Envoy on Financing for Sustainable Development and will be able to give us a pretty granular analysis of what's going on and what might be feasible in these current circumstances. We'll then move to Danny, who's a senior G20 advisor and with the South African Institute of International Affairs, who will be building on what Mahmoud has talked about, but also bringing in other aspects. For example, the recent ICJ advisory opinion on climate breakdown, which is a particular interest of mine. And then we will move finally to Lola, who's a consultant on energy and international financial reform, giving us more of a kind of helicopter overview of structural issues. Then there'll be some time for our three speakers to interact with comments and questions for each other before we move to the Q&A with everyone. And as Tamsin said, please do make use of the chat. Please don't assume that I will have seen things in the chat because of my split attention, but Tamsin and Jerry will no doubt flag things for when we come back to that part of the session. So, Mahmoud, if you're ready to go, could we move over to you for your introductory talk?
Right. Thank you so much, and greetings from Johannesburg, South Africa, where I'm attending the B20 meetings and preparation of the big summit here of the G20. And I'm happy that one of the topics that is going to be discussed, the issue of the cost of capital. I'm not in a position to share if that is going to be reflected in a summary of the presidency or a communique, but definitely it's very much shared and reflected on almost in every meeting have been having here, including yesterday when we were discussing the how to finance sustainable development and climate action. Today as well at the Bloomberg summit in Africa. So what we're talking about is current, is important, is impacting the future of generations. And nobody can claim, unlike what the late Queen Elizabeth II complained about in the aftermath of the global financial crisis, by saying it's awful, why nobody saw it coming. No, in this particular one, many people saw it coming, including the World Bank, well before the COVID crisis. So we cannot blame it on COVID. There was a new wave of debt by developing economies and emerging markets. Then after that, the World Bank liked to call it a silent debt crisis, because the borrower doesn't like to admit that they have problems. And the creditors are of different type of the old creditors to developing economies and emerging markets. The landscape of debt, or the architecture, is not dominated anymore by the Paris Club creditors. It's by borrowing from markets, including by low-income countries that started to have market access, and with some of the emerging market economies, including, of course, China. And the borrowers doesn't like to admit a problem, not to have the attention of the rating agencies, not to be downgraded, and not to complicate matters, and to avoid, to a great extent, any possibility of default. And actually, it would be fair to say that many countries avoided defaulting in their commercial debt by defaulting in their sustainable development goals. If the country in question, I can always mention that a country in question has a particular debt to GDP ratio or debt service ratio that is problematic. And we all know, or many of us know, the debt sustainability analysis and the debt framework of the IMF and the World Bank, which, by the way, they leave a lot to be desired, and that's why they are being reformed. But it's a better metric. I would really compare what we spend on debt service in many countries, including here in Africa, compared to what we spend on health, education, and essential services put together. And in many countries, it's either higher than health service or higher than education. But I'm concerned that in many countries, it is even higher, that cost of borrowing, higher than what is being spent on the investment in human capital. So we can say here that we need really to tackle this issue, despite the fact that the indicators on the screens, in some cases, beyond the countries that admitted already that they cannot honor their obligations, and they submitted requests to the common framework mechanism of the G20, that they are not able anymore to honor their obligations, including countries like Chad, Zambia, Ethiopia, Ghana. But there are many countries, as I said, would require the same kind of treatment. Why they are not going into that route? Basically, because it is not for all countries. The country has to be a low-income country, so this common framework doesn't accept middle-income countries. The second, it's a very long path until you get any kind of outcomes. It's a tedious kind of a mechanism, and yes, it has improved relatively of late, but it's not really in a way to encourage countries to use it to get rid of the burden of debt service. Let me just very quickly share with you some, not just of the assessments. I refer here to two reports I was part of, the 11 proposals report. This is the commission of the UN Secretary General that provided a report before Seville, with 11 specific proposals on fixing the global financial architecture. And as been mentioning in different contexts, it could be an act of exaggeration to call whatever we have an architecture or a system. And here I'm quoting the good assessment of Andrew Crockett, who used to be one of the officials at the IMF and then served at the BIS, and he was basically making this kind of judgment after the emerging markets crisis and after the global financial crisis. What we inherited of a system needs really to be developed. But anyway, we call it architecture or trying to fix it based on whatever left of a jargon. So this report has 3 levels. One is related to the global arrangements. The second is basically about regional and bilateral work, including South-South cooperation. And the third, what countries need to do themselves in order to deal with 3 aspects of the work: debt management, debt crisis prevention, and debt restructuring. I'm happy that this work is fully aligned with another report that I was a member of, led by Professor Joe Stiglitz and Martin Guzman. And it was a report commissioned by the late Pope Francis. Again, many of the measures of these 11 proposals are very much emphasized in different ways in the report led by Professor Stiglitz. And here we are emphasizing again the issues related to debt are compromising our efforts in achieving development and dealing with climate action because of the kind of prioritization being given now to debt service. So what are we proposing? One, on the early indicators and sharing signals before a country facing trouble. And the ultimate framework for that, practically speaking, is, though it's not optimal, but it's the ultimate one that we have, is the debt framework of the IMF and the World Bank, which is currently under revision. And it's 2 parts, one for low-income countries and the other one for countries with market access. And both are in need for revision because they don't have adequate treatment to domestic borrowing. The focus is on external debt borrowing. There is no distinction between what you spend on consumption and what you spend on long-term investments. Matters related to sustainability of finance are not adequately reflected in this particular framework. Currently, it's under revision by the IMF, the first one, the low-income countries one, and we hope that they can accelerate that. And there are many inputs that I encourage you to have a look at these suggestions on the areas related to the improvement in the DSA or the debt sustainability analysis or framework. There are other areas of work, including liquidity management. Many of the countries had fallen into solvency crisis because they didn't really manage matters better when they are only facing liquidity difficulties. And there is an issue as well about the centrality of the budget and how can we deal with the prioritization and the informing the policymaker through active parliamentary action or through whatever governance in the country in question to improve issues related to dealing with debt management and liquidity management, including interest rate exposure, including exchange rate exposure, including matters related how to deal with hot money. And we have a strong arrival today, especially with the use of stable coin that could really be used in different forms, long-term or short-term. But we need really to put more sophisticated teams to deal with issues related to that. There are other proposals, including the reform of the common framework of the G20. And as I mentioned, it's not really that complete to call it a framework. And it's not that common because it doesn't include adequate incentives to get the private sector to be involved. And at the same time, there are many challenges because even if the country in question is happy to participate, the length of the process and lack of timeliness and the lack of incentives because the IMF doesn't use the lending into arrears policies as needed. So there are lots of reforms to the common framework. I hope that they will be tackled soon, in addition to the matter I raised related to the fact that this framework doesn't cover the middle income countries. There are some proposals more strengthened in the report by Professor Stiglitz about the new issuances of SDRs. But we know issuance of SDRs have been always not just a technical solution, but a political one as well. It depends on the administration in the US. You are giving me a signal to wrap up. So let me just say a couple of things at the bilateral level and at the country level. One is related to this new work between different countries in the formation of a debt forum. And I'm happy that Spain, after the Seville Finance for Development conference, is adopting this debt forum, which is basically going to be a kind of a marketplace of ideas where the creditors would meet the borrowers for knowledge sharing, for technical assistance. This shouldn't be confused with another forum or club. This is only for the borrowers, and this will be the Global South answer to the Paris Club. And this is currently under construction. There is a group of 8 countries leading the work on that front. And this is one of the outcomes as well of Seville. And the final thing is basically whatever you do at these clubs, at these regional arrangements or global arrangements, it's all about the countries and the enhancement of their capacity, especially for debt management units, for their capacity to deal with debt swaps, for their capacities to build pipeline of investable projects and avoid indebtedness. There is a great deal of recommendations that are related to what we can really be doing better in debt management and debt prevention to avoid falling into debt crisis and its trap. Having said that, I'm happy to come back with any questions, and apologies, Peter, Tamzin, and colleagues, if I went beyond the limits. Thank you.
That was brilliant. Thank you, Mahmoud. Really useful grounding for us to build on. And there are already questions and comments coming in the chat, but let's keep moving for now. So, Danny, over to you.
Hi, can you hear me? Great. Hello, everyone. Mahmoud gave an excellent and very comprehensive overview of what's been proposed and what the state of play at the moment is. So I'm going to build on what he said and not repeat or try not to repeat the things he said, and to talk about what's happening, starting with the G20 and what we need to think about going forward beyond the G20. And so the first thing to say is, this year, and I think from what Mahmoud said, this is be clear, is that South Africa and the African Union have been very successful in raising awareness in the world on how serious the debt problem is, particularly in African countries, but not only in African countries, in other low-income countries as well. But while it's been successful in raising the awareness about this and getting discussion about what all the possible ways of managing this are, it hasn't been very successful in getting action to be taken on what needs to be done going forward. So if you look on, in order to succeed, you would need action both on process, so on how to improve the common framework, and on substance, on what the substantive issues are that have to be adjusted in order to make progress on the debt issue and to help restore countries to a sustainable debt or development performance. So in terms of the process, the common framework, as Mahmoud said, has not been working effectively. It's taken Zambia over 4 years to deal with its debt crisis, and it hasn't really finished. It's still involved in some negotiations with some of its commercial bank creditors and with some of its bilateral creditors. It hasn't yet concluded agreements either. And there are 2 reasons, or 2 areas where change is needed. The first one is the way the common framework is supposed to work is it sets up a sequence for how countries should deal with their debts. So first they're supposed to go to the IMF. The IMF does its debt sustainability analysis and says how serious the debt problem is and how much debt relief is needed in order for the country to actually regain a sustainable development financing position. And then once the IMF does that and it reaches an agreement on how much it will contribute to dealing with the problem, the country is meant to negotiate with its official creditors in a committee to reach some sort of framework agreement on how they will all help contribute. And then once that's done, it begins negotiating with its commercial creditors, its bondholders, and then its commercial banks on how much they will contribute. And all of them are meant to do so on a comparable basis, which means, as happened in the Zambian case, if the commercial creditors reach an agreement that the official creditors don't like because they think it's not comparable, they can delay the conclusion of the negotiation with the commercial creditors until they are satisfied. And that's why it takes so long. And so there's a need to deal with that sequencing problem and to work out a way either that there's consecutive negotiations, which would also have its problems in terms of its demands on the capacity of the country to negotiate with so many different creditors, but some way in which to shorten that process and to make it easier and less subject to, in a sense, a veto from the different actors. And secondly, there's a problem because of the role of the IMF. One of the issues that doesn't get as much attention as it should in the discussion, particularly of African debt, is that the biggest creditor, for many African debtor countries are the multilateral institutions in themselves. The World Bank in many cases, the IMF, as well as the African Development Bank. And by custom, those organizations have a preferred creditor status, which means that they don't have to contribute to the debt relief. They don't have to cut how much they're owed. They say they will give new funding, and that's their contribution. But as preferred creditors, they'll get paid before everybody else. And that's created a particular problem in Africa because there are a series of African multilateral financial institutions like the African Export-Import Bank, the African Finance Company, the Trade and Development Bank, which are also multilateral financial institutions and claim they're entitled to preferred creditor status as well. The problem is, and that's a reasonable claim, given that they have the same legal status as the World Bank or the IMF. The problem is that if all those institutions have a preferred creditor status, it means that there are less institutions to contribute to the actual debt relief, and it becomes harder without those institutions changing their position. So that's another issue that needs rethinking. In terms of substance, there's a serious problem built into the structure of sovereign debt discussions, which is everybody acknowledges sovereign debt is not just a financial and legal problem. It's a multifaceted development problem in the developing country. But when the negotiations happen around the contracts between the debtors and the creditors, which means that all you really focus on is what kind of accommodation do the creditors have to make in order to accommodate the fact that the debtor is no longer able to live up to the promises that it made in its contracts. There's no space in those negotiations for talking about all the debtor's other legal commitments that it has under its constitution, that it has to its public sector workers, that it has under the international treaties that it signed, to the development problems that it has. As Mahmoud said, is why should they be paying more to their creditors if they're spending on health and education of their own citizens? Those discussions cannot fit comfortably into the negotiations with the creditors. They, in a sense, externalized and become purely the obligation of the country to deal with on its own. And we need a structure that incorporates into those discussions, a way of talking about those issues in a more holistic way. Some of you as old as me might remember that in the 1980s debt crisis, President Nyerere in Zambia asked, why should we have to starve our children in order to pay our creditors? And everybody said he was being naive, not understanding the way finance worked. I think there are many things you can say about President Nyerere, but calling him naive is definitely not one of them. He knew exactly what he was doing, and that question has never received a full answer. And I think that's part of the problem that we have now, which also means that part of the problem is, which has become even worse since the 1980s, is that the climate crisis is making the situation even worse, because it means that countries are now having to cut what they spend to deal with the climate crisis, to either in mitigation or adaptation, let alone loss and damage because of extreme climate events. and they're having to cut all that because of their debt service obligations, or they're having to promote things like coal and other kinds of dirty technologies because that's the quickest way of earning money to pay back their creditors, at a time when they really should be looking at how do we begin dealing with mitigating the climate crisis and dealing with our need to develop the infrastructure for that. And so that leads me to thinking one way around, or one new way of looking at this problem is the recent ICJ advisory opinion on climate change, which is a very important opinion for many reasons. One is it's unusual advisory opinion from the ICJ, because it was a question from the UN asking them to look at what are the obligations of countries to deal with climate change and what are their responsibilities if they fail to do with that. There's nothing that unusual in that, but over 100 countries submitted statements or made oral presentations to the ICJ. And for the fifth time in the history of the ICJ's advisory opinions, it issued a unanimous decision by the members of the court. So it's an opinion that should have, even though it's non-binding, should have a high status in thinking and an importance in thinking about it. And what makes it particularly relevant in the debt context is the court said this is not just a question of what treaties countries have signed. They have customary law obligations, which means that they're obligations binding on all subjects of international law. So all states, all international organizations, and they said all the entities subject to the jurisdiction of those subjects, which means all the companies subject to their jurisdiction as well. And that they have two major obligations two customary obligations. The first one is an obligation to prevent harm to the environment and to do whatever is necessary to prevent harm, which means really to do due diligence and to do impact assessments up front. And I want to stress that the court said this is an obligation of conduct, not of result, because it understood that it's not easy for even the best impact assessments to fully understand what all the impacts will be, but enough to say you need to do something to show you understand what you're doing that affects the climate, how you've mitigated that, and why you think this is a reasonable outcome in this case. So that's obligation number one. Obligation number two is it said there's an obligation to cooperate, to engage in international cooperation, to deal with economic, social, and cultural problems that have global impact, and that a healthy environment is a precondition to doing that. So that there's a precondition as a duty on everyone to cooperate to avoid this, taking into account the different capacities and responsibilities of different actors. And what this says to me is that this means that when countries restructure their debt, all the participants, that includes the debtor as well as the creditors, have an obligation to understand, to do the studies, to understand what the impact of what they're committing to in their restructuring agreement is, and why they think this is the least costly or the best outcome that they can get in terms of environment and in terms of the human rights of their citizens on these issues. That's going to be a long haul to get governments and country and creditors to accept that. But it seems to me that at least from a legal principle point of view, it's pretty clear that there is obligations to do that. And I think there are forums where these issues can be raised in the future as well. And so going forward, I think Africa, South Africa, and the other G20 participants are going to have a responsibility to think through how do we incorporate this into the ways in which we restructure. And the Borrowers Forum that Mahmoud was mentioning is an important location for doing that. And I would suggest, in addition to the Global Sovereign Debt Roundtable that Mahmoud mentioned, there's a need for an African Sovereign Debt Roundtable where stakeholders in Africa can meet to talk about these issues, to develop an African position, and to think about how do we advocate for that in other global fora as well. Final thing I'd say is one area which has not received attention, but which is critical to this, is the need for some sort of independent review of the IMF. We've had that of the MDBs for a long time. We haven't had it of the IMF, even though the work of the IMF has changed dramatically. this year, after President Trump, the IMF might be talking less loudly about climate, inequality, gender, but they've changed a lot and they're dealing with those issues, and they should be dealing with those issues, but how they deal with them is an open question. And there's a need for a review of their operating principles and practices for doing that. And in that regard, it's important to remember that in addition to the SDRs, the IMF has something like 90 tons of gold on its reserves from the initial contributions that states made to their quotas when the IMF was set up in pre-1971, which it carries on its books at something like $50 an ounce. We know that gold is on the market value now is about $4,000 an ounce, which means there's a lot of hidden wealth in the IMF that could be tapped in some way creatively. There are lots of restrictions and complications with doing that, but it is an issue that should be investigated at some point. I'm going to stop at that point. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thank you, Danny. That was great. Maybe a point you could come back to when you're in your three-way exchanges is just the various competing areas of international rule of law, because, you know, on the one hand, you talked about the potential of the ICJ advisory opinion. On the other hand, of course, we still have all of the ISDS provisions in treaties of trade treaties of various sorts, and it feels to me as if those two things are in complete contradiction. So I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts on that. But now it's great to turn to you, Lola, to kind of follow on those two starring presentations with your own.
Hi, everyone. Thanks to Peter and Tamsin for the invitation, and to Danny and Mahmoud for some fascinating updates. And I'm hoping to pick up on some of the threads there, and hoping that I'll be able to carry on the conversation in a way that makes sense. I'd like to start with a simple but fundamental point. And that is that the global debt crisis is not a glitch in the balance sheets. As we've seen, it really is a fully blown human rights crisis and a development crisis. And I think I would argue, and it's probably in there somewhere in the UNCTAD latest documents, that it's one of the biggest obstacles to preventing countries from navigating the climate emergency. So debt today is a tool that sustains an unequal balance of power, and more than 3 billion people are living in countries that spend more on debt servicing than on health and education. So that means that debt doesn't just empty budgets, it actively decides whose priorities are funded and whose are pushed aside. And I would argue that the current debt architecture protects creditors from risk, while social, ecological, and gendered costs fall on countries and communities that have contributed the least to the climate crisis. And communities, or women, are paying through shrinking public services, intensified extraction and all the damage that incurs, and just dwindling public services and social safety nets. And the accounting norms that treat those externalities or that damage are not neutral. They're reinforcing the status quo. So moving on, or with that premise in mind, I'd like to focus a little more on one of the institutions at the heart of this crisis, which is the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF. And the IMF supposedly has a mandate to maintain global stability, something that was established in the aftermath of the Second World War, when the IMF was at the apex of its industrial power, if you like. Climate change wasn't on the agenda. We didn't have a multipolar society to the same extent as we do today. So we have to ask, stability for whom and at what cost? And I think that the IMF governance structure reveals the answer to this fairly clearly. It concentrates power in the hands of historic polluters, and the voting shares at the IMF reflect they're calculated in function of GDP, market openness, and not climate or ecological debt or climate vulnerability. And the United States effectively holds a de facto veto, where it has 16.5% of all votes of voting power. And in contrast, the entire African continent, I think of 54 countries, holds just 6.5%. But I think this is right, Matt. So when countries turn to the IMF, we're the lender of last resort, usually because they have no other option, and market access elsewhere has dried up, they hope at least to have some kind of policy space in order to navigate the crisis that's led them there in the first place. And I really don't think that it's a first choice for the majority of countries in the world. And instead of this policy space, they receive a policy straitjacket, which leads to austerity, privatization, and deregulation. And these are measures that erode public services, they weaken labor protections, they push countries deeper into extraction to earn foreign exchange to be able to pay the IMF and then other creditors, as we've established. They are pressured to export minerals on terms that don't necessarily lead to technology transfer or assure them better places on global value chains. And it also makes workers more precarious, making, once again, the poorest communities and countries absorb the cost. And so I think it's safe to say that these policies are fundamentally incompatible with a just energy transition. And if we look at Argentina, which is, yes, the IMF's biggest debtor, we can see that what was once an industrial, one of the most industrial states in the Americas, it's been rapidly deindustrialized under IMF surveillance. It has exited the Paris Agreement. Environmental protections have been rolled back, labor rights gutted, social safety nets obliterated, science and technology budgets slashed. Again, the wrong type of innovation has been removed and replaced at best with financial innovation, which I would argue is far less helpful and not the answer to the problem. Argentina owes the IMF more than any country in the world, and it will pay through 2030 around $6 billion in surcharges alone, which are penalty fees imposed on countries already in deep debt distress. So as we can see, this is debt coercion, and it shows that fossil fuel dependence is not just an accident, an unfortunate consequence of indebted countries. It's being actively built in or baked into loan agreements in order for countries to access liquidity and pay back their debts, which is, I think, a very worrying state of affairs. And if you think that matters couldn't get worse, they can. The debt trap is further tightened by trade and investment agreements. Many countries, again, under IMF tutelage or policy prescriptions, they signed investment treaties in the 1990s that even if they did exit them, which some of them have started to do, still have sunset clauses that lock in fossil privileges and investor privileges well into the future. So this is not just an issue of this generation. These are decisions that are affecting several generations to come at a time when we really cannot afford to be doing that kind of thing. And these investor agreements allow governments corporations to sue governments for billions if they adopt policies that interfere with their interests, essentially. And this is particularly true of fossil and mining firms. But they're also true of sovereign debt arrangements. So countries try to negotiate debt and bondholders sue. They try to phase out fossil fuels, oil companies sue for lost profits. They try to strengthen environmental standards through laws, and they face multi-billion dollar claims. And this litigation is not an exception. It's very much part of the business model, and it's something that's exacerbated in the absence of debt workout mechanisms. And it keeps countries locked into extraction, dependency, and debt for generations to come. So what do we have to change? Well, this is a long discussion that no doubt we'll start to have after these interventions. But I do think a fairer multilateral system is possible, although it's not happening at the pace that we need it to happen. But fundamentally, I think we have to replace creditor dominance with transparent debt resolution, curb predatory finance, give countries the fiscal space needed for resilience and resilient development, and climate action. And a reformed IMF, I think, would end punitive surcharges or rewrite debt rules that trap countries into austerity and to support decarbonisation rather than fossil expansion, as well as upholding labour rights, progressive taxation and strong environmental standards. Yet a new issuance of, and repeated, I would argue, issuance of special drawing rights would be very useful, but not linked to IMF voting shares, if that's possible. And I think that the liquidity has to reach countries that need it most. So they have to come without the conditionality that's been associated with either recycling or the Resilience and Sustainability Trust, which has not provided the answers that we were hoping for. Yes, sale or revaluation of the IMF gold reserves is something that's been discussed in the recent months, which sounds like an option that could work. But I think further than or beyond institutional reform, we have a role for everybody. I think lawmakers have to play a more active role in scrutinising loan agreements, demanding transparency, ensuring that public budgets aren't signed away behind closed doors. Again, we need to reform the web of investment treaties and ISDS mechanisms that are granting corporations more power than governments. And I think that what we've seen over the last two discussions on debt and more widely is that we're not lacking ideas and we're not lacking resources, albeit they're going in the wrong direction. But what we're lacking is political will from some and the courage to break the spell of financial orthodoxy, which is much harder than it sounds, it would seem, and rebuild the international rules around justice, around economic justice, around climate justice, and around energy justice. Thank you.
Wow. Well, thank you, all three of you. That's great. There's also some amazing questions and comments coming in the chat. I thought we'd just have a quick bit of time between the three of you there. And I did, Lola, your comments then kind of reminded me of Wallerstein's world systems analysis, where my understanding was he basically said that we nominally decolonized in this world. But in fact, the former colonies are now faced with such onerous debt and extractive trade systems that they are effectively colonized in terms of the extraordinary net payment flows from global south former colonies to global north creditor countries, that to all effects and purposes we've replaced colonization with debt colonization. I'm interested in not only your, but also Danny's and Mahmoud's thoughts about that as just as a kind of kickoff point.
Do you want me to?
Yeah, if you could kick us off there.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what's been happening, and I think that even resource people have been tracking resources, and I think there's been great work on this by Jason Hickel, and even I think by the UNCTAD. But there's very clearly a resource flow that's going from south to north and not in the other direction. So yes, talking about debt forgiveness is extremely helpful. Debt forgiveness would be wonderful, but not it's not going to get us anywhere if we don't change the rules of the system and the structural constraints. And as I think we've seen, that's not something that can be done just by the IMF. It's got to be something that's done through regional development banks, and to keep the pressure on spaces like the G24, the G20, and many others, and the G77, which I think has played a crucial role in keeping these issues on the table, and has been trying to do so for decades. But we're not where we need to be yet. But yeah, I think that showing very clearly where the resources are going, and that this is not a question of charity, it's a question of an outrageous system that is not functioning in the way that it should be, given the challenges we face.
Great, thank you. If we go in reverse order, Danny, coming back to you with that initial kind of point.
I mean, I think there's no question there's a systems problem, that the global system is not working for most people in most countries in the world. The problem is we're victims of path dependency. The world's been on this path for hundreds of years, and we're now trying to reverse a system that's developed over that period of time, which is an extremely difficult thing to do, even if you put aside all the vested interests and all the geopolitical power relations that keep it functioning the way that it does. So that in a sense, what we're trying to do now really is to come up with where are the gaps where we can make the changes that are not dead ends, but that will help us keep going in a dynamic way on a path forward to something that's a more sustainable and more fair system over time. The imperative to do that has become much more because of the climate crisis. The debt issue is really just a symptom of an underlying problem, but it's a way of getting into the system and saying we need to make changes that address these issues. It's where there's a gap that can be addressed. It's not an easy gap, and the discussion today is just a good indication of that. And as Lola said, there are lots of possible things that we could do. How do we get everyone to agree on that, of course, is the real challenge. And I think that's the challenge for all of us. It's not just for governments, it's for communities, for individuals. And we just have to keep plugging away at that and making the points over and over again that we've been making here. And part of the reason that I think the debate on the Borrowers Forum is such an important debate is because if borrowers get together and the point of the forum is not to negotiate debt transactions as a group. That's a fool's errand, to be honest with you. But to create a forum where there can be peer learning, capacity building, sharing of information, greater transparency on what the debt relations are, and developing of a coherent position that can be advocated and that can help countries improve their negotiating position in individual transactions going forward. And that's probably the best we can do, even though that's a very partial solution. But I'm sorry to not be more optimistic.
Thanks, Danny. Mahmoud, great.
Right. Well, a few reactions on building on what Danny and Lola mentioned. But let me emphasize the importance here of public choice. Countries shouldn't really be treated as lame ducks, helpless, cannot decide on their future. And we have seen even within the low-income countries, Some countries have been getting their act together, balancing their finances better, adopting scrutiny, prioritizing investments in their human capital. And they are not part of the problem today. And actually, some of them are trying to be part of the solution by being active in some of the proposals, including the Borrowers Club, because they are concerned about spillovers. If you are doing well at your home or your house, and then your neighbors are in trouble, there will be some forced migration. There could be some tension. So there is some sort of responsibilities within some particular regions, as I've seen it recently in the ASEAN countries and more now in Africa and Latin America. So this is one area. The second, again, back to the issue of public choice, is the people of the country, regardless of the system, need really to voice their priorities through elections in democracies, through whatever mechanism of interaction. We have seen the public, even in a one-party system like Vietnam, are sharing their priorities and opinion. So here there is an issue that's not really an issue of, yes, this is our bad luck, the world is not fair to us, the IFIs are basically controlled by few voices, which is true. And but again, you need really to do everything possible to prevent getting into that trap. And when you smell a problem or have a signal of a problem, you don't need to go to these institutions late in the game, because the IMF in particular doesn't have national programs. It has IMF programs. And there is very little really that you can do and change when you go to the IMF. If you go early in a healthier position, but you go there for insurance, for what so-called elite programs, you are likely to get one of these programs that are with less prerequisites and less conditions. But if you go late in the game, while the country is in the verge of default, there is a black market in its foreign exchange, there are external debt is eating up resources, so will be subject to these kind of tough medicine, and there is very little consideration for implications, be them social or political. And even with the great voices that we have been hearing for almost 4 decades or more, since the countries of the global south became more sophisticated to share their opinion, and not just to complain, but to give alternatives. This is what I see of the sophistication today of countries of the global south, including the host country of the G20 today. They have very good qualified people who can really not just to reject a program, but to put an alternative program. But actually, when you go to international institutions, you need really to put into consideration if you have every possibility to minimize the tough outcomes from joining their programs. And actually, we have some successful cases. Brazil went through a tough program in the past and succeeded. Greece, yes, with the help of the European Central Bank and the rest of the EU. Now it's one of the brighter spots in Europe. So Korea at some stage after the emerging markets crisis. So there are examples of success with the IMF. It's not all cases of failure. But what I'm saying here, that's basically minimize the need for going to the fire brigade by putting the house in order. Then I like to add to what Danny mentioned related to these kind of elements that have been added to the architecture. And again, I'm using it with the exaggeration that I emphasized. They are not going to be reforming the system. This system is inherited what's so-called the Bretton Woods system, the post-Second World War, what we celebrate of 80 years of today, or at least remember the 80 years, is not a creation of the world. It's creation of part of the world, of the winners of the Second World War. And the winners, unlike what's being put in history, the winner doesn't write history alone or only. The winner writes the future as well by putting frameworks, standards, rules of engagement. And here, nothing will happen on the monetary side or the financial side or even the economic side if the political side is not reformed. So we are very far from it. unless we realize that we're in a different world from that we inherited in the 1940s. It's a new world that's being created. Definitely, we are aspiring for a multipolar world, which we do not have. When we have this kind of a good understanding in a peaceful way, I think we can talk about fiscal, monetary arrangements, debt resolutions within that kind of a global perspective. But until that, we don't need to make the perfect enemy of the good. We have some good proposals like the ones outlined by the Jubilee report or by the UN Secretary General group that can really fix some of the problems, but they are far from perfect. And they are basically assuming that they have to be politically feasible in a time that we are in a bottom low when it comes to international cooperation. We shouldn't be forgetting that we are in tension when it comes to the geopolitics and geoeconomics, and tension is a kind of an underestimate of what we are going through. We don't need really to forget the kind of complications that is there today because of wars, like the one in Europe between Ukraine and Russia, and other wars, including in my region in the Middle East. So that is not the environment that you can really see it as conducive for major reforms. And that's why I admire the leadership of South Africa, that despite all of these kind of political economic dynamics, is trying to get something out from that whole mess in the world today, with deficit of trust and surplus of crises, to get us some decent declarations, at least from the committees that have been meeting, from the business community, and from, I hope, from the G20 in a couple of days.
Thank you, Mahmoud. And thank you, all three of you. I was hoping to have a bit more time for the three of you to interact, but I think we've got so many great questions and we've used up the best part of an hour that I might move on now to dealing with some of the questions from the chat and other questions that come in. I'm going to abuse my chair's privilege by just making one quick comment in response to Mahmoud, which is I'm not sure that all the Greek analysts would agree that the ECB helped. I'm thinking particularly of Yanis Varoufakis's comment
exactly.
on that quotes help from the ECB and of course the German state. But anyway, I'm going to start with one of the later questions, actually, which came from Susie Moser, who, paraphrasing, said, what happens if the system isn't changed, if the basic underlying creditor-focused, enabling architecture goes on as it does at the moment, fundamentally? So what would a collapse of this whole system look like? Susie, if you want to add anything to that question, please kind of turn your camera on and tell us, but otherwise we'll just go straight into responses.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. I'll leave my camera off. It's too early to be visible, but I appreciate this conversation. I guess the only thing I would add is what opens up after this particular trapping system collapses, right? What are the opportunities once we just all break under this burden?
Great question. Any of the three of you want to have a go? And also, maybe if we could keep responses to at most 2 or 3 minutes, just to give us time to work through the questions.
Well, I have super pragmatic, technical answer to this big question. Regionalize, localize, projectize. So I see the world going more regional for solutions, and I already referred to the case of the ASEAN, navigating the tough waters through collaboration regionally, and minding all of the that could come arising from China, US or others. This is one. Localize as a bottom-up approach, not to do something better, assuming that it's going to be trickling down. And the third, let's do better pipeline of investable projects that are less dependent on debt. We are just focusing on the debt issue. So these are basically the three practical things. And meanwhile, hope for the best when it comes to the global system, which I'm not seeing coming soon.
Thank you. Danny?
I mean, I think Mahmoud has given a good answer. when Susie says collapse, if she means that the whole system collapses, I mean, be careful what you wish for, because that could be there'd be many opportunities then, but that's the Bretton Woods moment, where the world that we know has ended and has to be reconstructed on a completely different basis. And look what it took us to get there. It took 2 world wars and a Great Depression. So I think we should be careful before wishing for that. But that is certainly a possibility. And I would add, we've had hints of that through the global financial crisis and the COVID crisis. And the world handled the one reasonably well through the G20. The other one, the COVID crisis, it handled terribly because there was a zero-sum response to the distribution of vaccines. And so we shouldn't be optimistic that small crises or relatively small crises like that can lead to happy outcomes.
Thanks, Danny. Given your comments on Bretton Woods, I'm very forcibly reminded that, of course, Keynes and various people went into Bretton Woods with an incredibly different view of what would be an appropriate international architecture, a self-balancing system, in fact, which would ensure that creditors stopped being creditors and debtors moved out of debt. And the US basically blocked that entirely and introduced the current system which we have. But of course, that's in the past. But
can I just add one response to that?
Yeah, go for it.
One is to remember that Keynes was there as the advocate for a seriously compromised debtor country. And so what he was proposing was suitable for a debtor country. And he never mentioned the needs of colonies, which were not independent at that point. And so I would be wary of relying too much on Keynes for the optimal outcome.
I would love to see an IMF that prioritized debtor countries over creditor countries myself. But anyway, Lola, do you want to chip in on this?
Yeah,
or
yeah, very quickly. Yes, I think that during COVID and financial crises, we have seen that countries step up, and sometimes there are injections of liquidity that are exceptional. But I think we also saw that the responses to that were both uneven and unequal throughout the world. So I think that on the one hand, there are lots of countries that are being pushed, back towards becoming commodity exporters. But I also think that there have been interesting regional responses, particularly, in this case from the African Development Bank. But they're, also constrained because they're often not the sole creditors. And I think that, what we see are countries that are essentially squashed between a rock and a hard place, trying to, play between big powers without, seriously annoying or getting on the bad side of either. So yeah, very uneven and unequal responses, perhaps with windows of opportunity, but yeah, not the answer, I don't think.
Thank you, Lola. Turning to one other kind of meta question, because there are lots of great questions of more detail as well. And I'm going to ask Indy to chip in a moment, whose point, which is that surely we need to move away from a system rooted or a response rooted in appeals to morality towards a response which shifts the underlying power grammar. Maybe Indy, you could build on that, and I would note that there have been some kind of interesting responses to your initial post in the chat as well.
Yeah, no, it's just I just feel the conversation seemed to be rooted in someone giving a shit about human rights. And it's a great argument. We can have conversations with ourselves about that. But I just don't see a counterparty to that conversation. So I think one of the things that I'm worrying more and more about is the value of being human is systemically diminishing relative to assets. So all the historic arguments where you say, oh, you invest in human capital and it has economic benefits, I'm not sure those arguments even stand up anymore. Because so the fundamentals of our arguments are actually being ripped away from us. And I think it requires us to form a whole new form of argumentation, which which drives this conversation in a different way. And I think I have some intuition about where we need to go with that. But I also, I think it was mentioned very briefly, the stablecoins issue. I think we have to look for new pathways of creating liquidity, not rooted in debt, not rooted in borrowing. And I think there's indigenous pathways of construction of liquidity, which I think are going to be critical to actually unleashing and unwinding the kind of debt colonial model that we've been operating in. And whilst we preserve debt as an instrument for capitalization, I think we're going to preserve the colonial power system. I think we have those technologies. I think Africa should be leading on currency innovation and resource currency innovation. And the Union sets up the landscapes for that. And for me, that's the pathway of bypassing this whole conversation. I think the debt story will not move, but currency liquidity and new forms of stablecoin issuances, protocols for that, creating that is probably the kind of key innovation that Africa could bypass this whole story. And I think that would set the precedence for that framework, because of the resource frameworks and resource rights that exist in Africa, that liquidity can be constructed. So I suppose my intuition is like, do we need an oblique pathway here? And do we need to be focusing on an oblique pathway rather than appealing to debtor countries and frameworks? I just don't think that it's going to happen that way. So that was it. Sorry.
Great. Thanks, Indy. Again, learned panel. No doubt you're going to get tested by these questions.
Yep.
Any responses?
Well, this is another tough question, and I will not be very diplomatic about it. The issue of human rights is not really visible in the whole discussion. With all admiration to the Human Rights Commission of the UN and their important rapporteur reports about the debt crisis implications on compromising human rights. There is a series of that. I admire the team who has been doing that under tough circumstances as well, because they need to get evidence in a very cost-effective way from the countries impacted. And unfortunately, even some of the countries impacted are complicating the process of collecting the data, because again of this issue of keeping the debt crisis silent is still there. So but at the same time, I may really say with comfort that people do care about human rights, but the leadership of many countries don't. And this is the problem. You are, at the end of the day, you are impacted by not the acts of the people, perhaps the choices of the leaders. But again, the leaders do not care. And even if I quote my good friend, Mark Lowcock, the former head of OCHA and DFID, when he said, well, during COVID crisis, even if you don't care about others, care about yourself, and it will be an act of self-interest to do this kind of support to others. Even with this kind of very selfish, with any lack of altruistic behavior attached to it, people, because of their transactional, short-term, selfish approach, the leaders are basically pushing us away from these kind of holistic, comprehensive, long-term solutions. Having said that, as an economist, I have to treat matters as given. I have to hope for the best, but I have to work with whatever means. And that's why when I mentioned the 11 proposals, I know that some of the more optimistic views, they said, well, why you are not really more bold than the 11 proposals that you put? Because, well, the list of technical proposals for dealing with the debt crisis are available to anyone. But basically, the effort is basically to make sure that these debt proposals, including even debt swaps, sometimes is being complicated, despite the fact that the element of debt forgiveness in the debt swap is very, very small, not to be compared at all to what other leaders like the HEPIC leaders did a few years back for Africa. So this is a fact, and I can really share with you the concern which is impacting our work. And it's basically because of this deficit of trust we are in these crises, as being emphasized by the Secretary General of the UN. But having said that, can I just do two quick, because you mentioned the issue of the two quick responses. You mentioned the importance of the stable coins. The stable coins, they are stable as far as they are linked to a stable currency. I have very big question marks about the long-term stability of some of the currencies that these stable coins are attached to, and their instruments and their papers that are coming, including securities. So there are many question marks. The stable coins could be the best thing that happened or the worst thing ever that happen, because it could lower transaction costs, it could bypass intermediaries, it will not get you to rely on a SWIFT system. It will really help you in different ways. But at the same time, could be the open gate for losing control over your money supply. This will be the open gate for fast dollarization, because it's not Egypt or South Africa that are doing the stable coins today. They are using stable coins. These are denominated primarily in the US dollar. So this is basically an issue of dollarization that will make monetary authorities and fiscal authorities losing controls unless, and all of the things that they have in the toolbook when it comes to foreign exchange management, capital flows management, monetary policy, all of that, these are basically tools for fighting the old war. The stable coin that is so far 300 billion and marching fast towards $1 trillion, as mentioned by Stephen Merrin in his address in the BIS few days ago, this will be transformational. It's not just the Africans or the Asians are concerned. Please check the reports coming from the European system today about the implications of further dollarization. That definitely will be good for the United States based on these arguments, but I'm not quite sure that what's good for the United States is good for the rest of the world.
Great, thanks. Danny or Lola, any comments on stablecoin or other issues raised by Indy?
On the stable coins, I think Mahmoud summarized the situation well. The only caution I would add to that is, if you look at who's behind the stable coins, their concern with public safety and well-being doesn't seem all that evident. And so I would suggest we should approach it with great caution. Just on the human rights issue, I think it's important to point out that in addition to the reports that Mahmoud was mentioning, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which are now about 15 years old, have been taken seriously by a number of companies and have been used in a number of different ways. One of the things I always find remarkable is that if you look at the major creditor banks and asset managers, they all have human rights policies easily findable on their websites, yet they never seem to use them in sovereign debt. And then at some point, they're going to need to be called, their bluff is going to need to be called, because it's just ridiculous that they have the policies and they never use them. Also, if you look at the climate situation, there's this enormous climate litigation going on around the world. There are lots of important cases which are forcing companies to think a lot more carefully about what their responsibilities socially are. Mining companies have changed dramatically because of that. And BNP Paribas was sued or lost a judgment recently in the English courts because of its dealing, not in the English courts, in the US courts, I think. But they lost a judgment in one of the major creditor jurisdictions because of their engagement in terrorism in Sudan. And they need to pay compensation to the victims of the Sudanese government, which if the judgment is upheld, and I'm sure they're going to appeal that, is going to be an important finance and human rights decision that will have implications way beyond just that particular case. So I wouldn't give up on the human rights discourse quite as quickly as your question suggested.
Thanks, Danny. Lola, any comment?
Yeah, hopefully just quickly. I think that going back to the human rights and the moral discourse, that as imperfect as it might be, it can also be understood potentially as like a secular, so not always, but a language that kind of makes the stakes of what we're actually negotiating clear, like beyond monetary terms. And it's been an effective instrument, if you like, in trying to make clear the social environmental impact of the decisions that we're taking in a way that is relatively clear to present and future generations, which I would argue is still something that's worth fighting for. And then also a side comment is that I think that efforts, which is not what you were getting at, I think, but there have been other efforts in trying to make some of these arguments clear. For example, monetizing, some of the resources and trying to look at environmental and social damage, if you like, in monetary terms by giving a value to things. And I think that they've largely failed as well. So in this, in response to trying to organize and to visualize future responses, one of the things that occurs to me is resource cartels, which is something that's obviously, I think Mahmoud is probably a better place to discuss this, but certainly, OPEC started at least originally as a fairly progressive response to try to control and seize control of oil prices. And no, that's pretty much it, I think. That's what.
Okay. Well, and thanks, Lola. That raises an interesting point, doesn't it? Which is that OPEC certainly had an impact, and it certainly was a powerful response to the kind of colonized form of trade agreement that we see as a dominant norm now. And it sounds as if the kind of debtors club, et cetera, that's the kind of moving towards some kind of more coherent response from debtors. Mahmoud, could I just ask you, and this relates to a question by earlier from Godelieve, who I think has just had to leave us, but to what degree are the current attempts to have more coherent responses, whether they're through clubs or collaborations, are they actually pushing at the edge of what's possible, or are they assuming basically creditor dominance and power and trying to kind of work within that framework in a way that is acceptable to the creditors? And maybe you could also pick up on differences, if there are substantial differences, between creditor nations and creditor commercial entities, because of course someone earlier, Lola, I think, was talking about the outcomes of ISDS judgments and the fact that you now have vulture funds buying those debts in order to enforce them in these extraordinary secretive tribunal.
Well, in this fast-changing world, matters have changed a great deal. In my home country, Egypt, when we did the structural adjustment and economic reform program with the IMF, World Bank, and the Paris Club in early 1990s, the Paris Club was very much unpopular, to the extent that there were popular songs against the rules of the Paris Club. Now, I see the Paris Club, given its share of the total credit, is the one that is pushing for more transparency, better disclosure, trying to provide technical assistance. Even in the formation of this club, I am happy that the Secretariat were very much of the Paris Club, have been very much helpful in sharing knowledge and sharing their experience during the 70 years since their existence. So it's a different Paris Club from the one that was dominating the scene in the past. Definitely still has a say. Definitely it's not coming from the dominance to zero. But in the case of the low-income countries, its share today is around 10% compared to 40% 20 years ago. So based on this weight, I would say benefit from that. And then all of these attempts, I would say, the three mechanisms and forum clubs that came out from the Seville forum in July, the debtors to meet the creditors. This is about the development and operationalization of the responsible lending and borrowing principles. And more about knowledge sharing and technical assistance. Then, as mentioned by Danny, is the Borrowers Club. The answer to the Paris Club is going to be again on knowledge sharing, technical assistance. But I think one of the major outcomes that I hope to have serving in the IFIs, it will be great and it will not really harm anyone if to push these institutions to be better governed, the IFIs, IMF and the World Bank, and to discover the beauty of even-handedness. That would be great contribution from the Borrowers Club. Perhaps down the road, when they are themselves, that club with its members have the sophistication, they can step in some individual cases. But I think I at the initial stage of formation, I very much subscribe to what Danny mentioned. I would subscribe as well to its importance to have chapters like an African chapter or a Caribbean chapter or a Latino chapter, but that needs to be within the bigger club because, mind you, in the past, there were a couple of attempts to form such borrowers club, including in Cartagena back in 1984, and it failed. And then another attempt by a group of 10 countries of Africa after the global financial crisis, and it was an African club and it failed. So I think what we have today is a kind of global momentum, and the 8 countries are coming from the 4 regions of the developing economies and emerging markets. And perhaps after the formation, we can have these kind of specialized regional bodies. Meanwhile, there could be something that could happen, again, linking the whole thing to the stable coin. And you mentioned Keynes of his sophisticated foresight. If people followed his advice, perhaps wouldn't have had the Second World War, because he spotted the economic consequences of a bad treaty, the Survey Treaty, the Versailles Treaty, the Versailles Treaty, and then he mentioned the Bancor, and the Bancor could be, in a good way, that all of the currencies today could really be the new SDRs, monetize it, and this would be the new stable coin. And that could be the answer after the collapse of the Bretton Woods system in 1971, after what's called the Nixon shock. But we're not seeing that coming because, again, the technical solution is there. Is it technically feasible? And this is a test of what I said. Is it technically feasible to get the SDR at retail level, monetize it, support it, and make it the stable coin of the world with the weight that we have of the US dollar, euros, renminbi, and the rest of, and the sterling, and the rest of the currencies in that basket? Yes, it's technically feasible. Will it be politically endorsed? I doubt it. I wouldn't really bet on it. So here, this is basically the politician's role. It's the art of the possible. The art of the possible is what you got on these in these reports. Far from perfect, but definitely much better than what we have today.
Thank you. I'm aware we've got 9 minutes left. Danny, if I could go to you next, and maybe if you've got anything to comment on that, great. But also, as we run out of time, if you could comment a bit on what South Africa has achieved in its year of G20 leadership with regard to debt, and where that might go with, well, firstly, without US participation, but secondly, with a handover coming to the US, isn't it, I think? So be interested in your thoughts. And that really links back to the comment I made a long time ago about the breakdown of rule of law potentially at an international level.
I mean, I think the South African year's G20 presidency didn't turn out the way we would have liked. It looked like there was more that was possible at the beginning than it has in fact been possible. But I think that what has been achieved, as I said at the beginning, is that the issue of the awareness of the debt issue and the development financing crisis generally in Africa is much greater now than it was. There's a greater understanding of how serious the problem is and of how much the need for a solution is there. That's number one. Number two, I mean, as you know, the G20 consists of really 130 working group meetings and ministerial meetings over the course of the year, ending in the summit. In those working groups, there's been a lot more progress made on specific issues. So the development working group managed to reach a consensus and issue a declaration. There's been some work around some of the critical mineral issues, not as much as is needed, but there has been some progress. And in that sense, the year has not been a failure. The fact that, I mean, given that there are potentially 5 leaders who are not coming to the meeting this year, the chances of reaching a declaration that has traction is not great. But that's not South Africa's fault. I mean, no one can, despite what President Trump says, no one can really blame South Africa for the fact that the US has decided not to come, or that President Xi from China is not coming. Milei, we know, is in talk to the US, and so doesn't have a whole lot of options, I guess, on whether he comes. But I think the other thing, and this discussion today shows that there's a lot that can be done outside the direct ambit of the G20. and that I think what has to happen going forward is that South Africa and Africa, as well as other countries, have to take these issues on and deal with them in other forums as well, both regional and global. We know next year is likely to be a complicated year, but we should remember also that crises could happen that could change the US's view on the importance of the G20, the need to cooperate with other countries. And so that maybe more can happen next year, but if not, there are other ways to deal with these issues and then pick them up again once the US leadership is over. And finally, just the fact that the US won't be there in some ways makes life a little bit easier because you don't have to reach consensus on everything. Though, as we know, they do have proxies in the meeting who might make sure that's not so simple either. But thanks.
They certainly do. Thanks, Danny. Lola, if I could come to you, and we're moving towards closing comments, but something that you mentioned and others is how our current debt architecture is reinforcing and worsening climate breakdown, forcing debtors into extractivism and other things. So maybe if you could, in some kind of final thoughts, pick up on that issue in particular, because it strikes me that obviously we ain't seen nothing yet when it comes to climate cataclysms, and those mainly are so far impacting on the debtor nations. So, just looking at, for example, Jamaica, the cost of the most recent typhoon, I think, is being estimated at well over 200% of GDP. It feels as if the time for radical solutions is obviously on us, and yet there's no way that the creditor nations are going to move. Any thoughts?
Well, I think firstly there has only been nominal commitment on the part of multilateral development banks to align themselves with the Paris Agreement, for example. Kind of some fairly weak declarations were made, and I think we shouldn't forget that these are public development banks, and that there's a fair amount of pressure that we can still put on these institutions to set baselines in what debt agreements can involve, and that may be an interesting place to start. Things like disaster clauses in debt agreements are the bare minimum, and I think that a fair amount has been already done to make that a reality. But the fact that these are banks that are essentially funded through public budgets should provide some kind of leverage to hold them much more accountable to their alignment with basic attempts to cut emissions and to keep us below 1.5.
Thank you, Lola, and thanks to all three of you, Danny, Lola, and Mahmoud. Really brilliant conversation. Obviously, lots of pretty tricky things, but if we don't talk about them properly, we won't get much further with kind of trying to respond proportionately to them. And it feels as if really honest conversations about the depth of the crisis that is manifesting in so many different ways are a good foundation for that. Given the time, I'm going to turn to you, Tamsin, in case you've got any thoughts not only about today but also about the final upcoming edition of this series of conversations and dialogues.
Thank you. And thank you definitely, Mahmoud, Danny, and Lola for today, and Peter, as ever, for your facilitation. We do have a conversation on Thursday, which I know is quite soon to this. I've put the link in the chat, but really trying to see what is beyond the kind of architecture that we have. And Indy will be on that conversation with Joe Swinson and Brett Scott. So there will be some continuation of the threads. I think, Lola, you mentioned, aid, trade, innovative finance, debt, and really how do we take that forward into any practical thing. So please do join us. The recording for this, and I noticed somebody mentioned that nobody could copy the chat. I'm really sorry, I don't know why. It's not an intentional blockage of information sharing, but it will be shared with the notes and the recording of this. And please follow us on LinkedIn. We have been highlighting Mahmoud and Danny and Lola's writings on this. So if you're wanting to see what else is being done. And I wish you a very good meeting in South Africa, Mahmoud and Danny. And Peter, thank you. Lola, thank you. Thanks everyone for joining today.
Thank you. Be safe.
Thank you for all the questions in the chat. Sorry we couldn't get through all of them, but brilliant questions as always in these dialogues and comments. Thank you all.
Thank you.